think of ourselves as the most powerful beings in the universe, it's unsettling to discover that we're wrong. Time has come to see the world as it is.
Can we pull back the veil of static and reach into the source of all being? Behind this curtain lies this random pattern generator. You will be responsible for an escalation that will destroy everything.
Hello, welcome to Chaos Shamanism. First off, I just wanted to say that I talked about Ouija boards in the last episode, but then completely forgot to warn against them. In fact, I would urge everyone to never use one. I used to think that the warnings against them were just Christian cultural superstition, but after personal experience and the testimony of many others, I now know that the attitude of fear surrounding Ouija boards is well-founded. I've heard many different groups of people warn against their use, be they the aforementioned religious people, cult practitioners, or paranormal investigators. I would not, however, condemn the use of automatic writing. What comes through in automatic writing seems to be more associated with the practitioner, for example, your superconscious mind or a personal spirit ally, whereas Ouija boards act as conduits for all kinds of personalities, benevolent and malevolent. And remember, you don't necessarily have to use a traditional Ouija board for it to work. When I would do it, I just wrote out letters and numbers on a sheet of paper and then placed my hand over it. My hand would then be pushed to different letters to spell things out. The real danger with boards isn't necessarily the communications coming through, but the fact that they seem to open a sort of gateway or portal which then remains open, allowing all kinds of beings to come through. The room in which I would use the board became a very active spiritual crossroads. It became so bad that I eventually had to put my mattress in my closet and sleep in there. Unfortunately, the spiritual infection eventually spread to the rest of my apartment. Fortunately, I don't live there anymore, and I pity whoever moved in after me. Now, for the news section from now on, I'm going to be pulling the stories from a handful of books here, and I'll just read the titles. The Field Guide to Extraterrestrials by Patrick Hugh. The Complete Guide to Mysterious Beings by John Keel. Passport to Magonia by Jacques Vallée. From Flying Toads to Snakes with Wings by Carl P.N. Schuker. UFOs Caught on Film by B.J. Booth. The Charles Fort books, The Book of the Damned, Lo, New Lands, and Wild Talents, and Unexplained Mysteries of the 20th Century by Janet and Colin Board. Now, having said that, here's the news.
What the hell in God's name is going down here?
September 9th, 1981, Cape Town, Argus, South Africa. Mrs. Maggie Hendricks vomits frogs. A police sergeant avows that he personally saw Mrs. Hendricks upchuck a frog the size of a man's hand. Mrs. Hendricks also appears to spew forth nails and bits of broken bottle glass. She also appears to puke tadpoles and balls of hair and knife blades. Mrs. Hendricks alleges that she has had this unique problem for over a year. She also alleges that an invisible man visits her and makes indecent proposals. It is her understanding that all this is happening because she rejected the advances of a witch doctor shortly before these afflictions fell upon her. October 3rd, 1933, London Morning Post. A phantom train reported several times in Tortuna, Sweden. It appeared to run on tracks where real trains ran, but not at times when the real trains were running. The Post adds that a similar phantom train had been reported in Lapland 2 years earlier. That accursed thing was even worse. It ran where there were no tracks, and it not only startled human observers, but allegedly caused stampedes among the reindeer. September 21st, 1877, New York Sun. W. H. Smith saw what appeared to him to be a winged human being over the sky of Brooklyn. July 1868, Zoologist. Another ambiguity, a Copiapo, Chile. It appeared to be an airship with lights and a noisy motor, according to some. It appeared to be a gigantic bird with reptile-like scales, according to others. This was 37 years before the airplane. 15th of April, 1957, Sunday Express, England. A fall of 1,000 franc notes in Bourges, France. The Express says that there were thousands of them. Haunted People by Nandor Fodor, Signet, New York, page 154. In the early 1930s, in a farmhouse called Dorlish Caution on the Isle of Man, lived James T. Irving and his wife and children, and Geff. Geff appeared to be shy and reclusive, like many of us eccentrics. He appeared to hide in the walls and never made what are called personal appearances. But he talked to anybody who cared to converse with him. Geff identified himself as a very, very clever mongoose. On the other hand, Geff was even more immodest on other occasions. He is alleged to have identified himself as the eighth wonder of the world, the Holy Ghost, and the fifth dimension. Geff would put on psychic demonstrations for callers. For instance, they would toss coins and catch them. Geff would cry out heads or tails. Fodor alleges that Geff was very accurate. Objects appeared to fly around when Geff was performing. 40 in Time, summer 1980. More on Geff. Harry Price, the psychic investigator, came to the Isle of Man to speak with Geff, who apparently had an even lower opinion of Mr. Price than the fundamentalists have. The appearance was rude and uncouth in that case. Geff appeared to urinate on Mr. Price's shoes. Another investigator, identified only as Wilder, spoke at length with Geff and decided the little fellow was a mongoose after all, and not the Holy Ghost or the fifth dimension. Said Wilder, "The mysterious powers of animals are only beginning to be understood." After the Irvings sold the farm and left, the next owner shot an animal on the property. It was a mongoose. If it was Geff, it didn't have time to shout, "Stop! I'm really the Holy Ghost!" If it wasn't Geff, it was another of our odd coincidences. Flying Saucer Review, 18, number 6, November to December 1972, pages 23 and 24. And also further details about Hitchhiker from Space, Flying Saucer Review, Case History, Supplement 14, April 1973. On August 28, 1972, an Eduardo Fernando de Dieu was driving home in an old car at 3 a.m. when he stopped to fix the car's malfunctioning radio antenna. That's when he first noticed the hitchhiker by the side of the road and gave the man a lift. The dude tried conversing with his passenger, but gave up when the man's only replies were incomprehensible sounds. The strange hitchhiker was a little more than 6 feet tall and wore a cap-like hat and a coat with its collar turned up. He looked human except for his head, which resembled those of the statues on Easter Island. His long chin seemed almost to reach the middle of his chest. After about 15 miles, the car suddenly lost power and its lights went out. Didier then saw what appeared to be a big luminous bus overturned on the highway ahead. When he stopped the car and got out to get a better look, he realized the bus was a UFO. The object, which was actually moving over a field, had white lights in its windows and a green light underneath. By the time Didier turned around and got back in the car, however, the hitchhiker was gone. The passenger's side door was open, and its handle was wrenched off and lying on the floor. With the object gone, the car now started properly, and Didier drove around trying to find his passenger, but without success. A nearby night watchman later confirmed the presence of a mysterious light hovering over the area. Humanoids fitting the same long chin description were seen repeatedly in connection with UFOs over the 7-month period that followed in Argentina, and as recently as September 1994 in the United States. And now, a list of strange sightings seen between 1966 and 1967. On September 1st, 1966, several adults in Scott, Mississippi saw a man-shaped object maneuvering at low altitude. On November 1st, 1966, a National Guardsman at an armory near Camp Conley Road in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, saw a large brown man-shaped figure on a limb of a tree. On November 12, 1966, 5 male adults in a cemetery near Clendenin, West Virginia, saw a flying brown human-shaped object. On November 15, 1966, 2 married couples in a TNT testing area near Old Power Plant in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, saw a large gray man-shaped creature with blazing red eyes. It had a 10-foot wingspan and pursued their auto. On November 16, 1966, 3 adults and 3 children near the same TNT area saw a tall grayish creature with glowing red eyes. All right, now for some UFO sightings. On the 1st of July in 1868, in Copiago, Chile, a strange aerial construction bearing lights and making engine noises flew low over this town. Local people also described it as a giant bird covered with large scales producing a metallic noise. Although not an actual landing, this is the first instance of close observation of an unknown object at low altitude in the 19th century. I think it's also interesting to note that this is something I already read in another source just earlier about the thing in the sky people thought was a big bird. Oh, interesting. Well, that doubles up the news, but whatever. There you go, multiple sources. Yeah, and that's the thing. Some of these reports may double up over time because I am pulling them from many different sources, but that's kind of a good thing in a way, as long as it doesn't happen too much. It just kind of shows you that there's, it's not just one thing somebody just made up in one book. All right, December 7th, 1872, 0100 hours. In Banbury, Great Britain, at King's Sutton, an object resembling a haystack flew on an irregular course. Sometimes high, sometimes very low. It was accompanied by fire and dense smoke. It produced the same effect as a tornado, felling trees and walls. It suddenly vanished. Sometime in 1877, there was a vague report of, in Aldershot, Great Britain, a strange being dressed in tight-fitting clothes and shining helmet soared over the heads of two sentries, who fired without result. The apparition stunned them with something described as blue fire. On May 15th, 1879, at 2140 hours, in the Persian Gulf, two very large wheels were seen by witnesses aboard the ship Volture. These wheels were spinning in the air and slowly coming to the surface of the sea. Estimated diameter 40 meters, distance between the objects 150 meters, speed about 80 kilometers per hour, duration 35 minutes. Sometime in 1880, in eastern Venezuela, a 14-year-old boy saw a luminous ball descending from the sky and hovering near him. He felt somehow drawn to it, but succeeded in backing away in spite of his terror. On the evening of March 26, 1880, in Lamy, New Mexico, four men walking near Galisteo Junction were surprised as they heard voices coming from a strange balloon, which flew over them. It was shaped like a fish and seemed to be guided by a large fan-like device. There were 8 to 10 figures aboard, and their language was not understood. The object flew low over Galisteo Junction and rose rapidly toward the east. On June 11th, 1881, at 0400 hours, between Melbourne and Sydney at sea in Australia, the two sons of the Prince of Wales, one of them to become the King of England, were cruising aboard La Bachante when an object resembling a fully lighted ship was seen. Quote, a phantom vessel all aglow. And now for some strange events from around the world. In March 1945, in the Aleutian Islands, U.S. sailors saw a UFO rise up out of the sea. On the 16th of March 1961, in Admiralty Bay, Antarctica, a Brazilian meteorologist and 5 others saw a reddish egg-shaped UFO which traveled slowly and split into 2 separate objects, identical to the original. They then changed to bluish-white, brightened, and vanished. In 1956, in the Atacama Desert in Argentina, giant beings left footprints in snow on mountains. And on the 28th of July 1962, near Bajada Grande, a student on a motorcycle was attacked by a round-headed being with white hair and 3 eyes. Having grabbed the boy's collar, the entity then did a half-turn like a robot, the boy said, and then it departed. In June of 1959, in Buenos Aires Harbor, the Navy chased an unidentified submarine object. In 1953, in Cerro del Valle, San Juan, a man sleeping rough at his mica mine saw a beautiful woman in green. In 1922, in Chubut territory in Argentina, rumors of monsters in Patagonia. A gold prospector named Sheffield found a trail of flattened vegetation and, quote, I saw in the middle of the lake an animal with a huge neck like that of a swan, and the movement in the water made me suppose the beast to have a body like that of a crocodile. In 1865, the Missouri Democrat newspaper published a report from a trapper called James Lumley, who claimed to have seen an unidentified bright luminous body in the sky near the upper Missouri River. The next day, he reported that he had found a crashed craft of some type that had cut a path through the woods. He claimed that the object had different compartments and hieroglyphic-like symbols carved into its surfaces. The incident signaled the beginning of modern UFO reports in America and around the world.
What the hell in God's name is going down here?
That was a public service announcement designed to scare the shit out.
I want to mention that after making contact with my guide, or higher self, I made contact with other spirits who were not a part of me but were still benevolent. They eventually became very close to me. I want to stress that I did not make contact with them via the Ouija board technique. Now, I'd like to talk about some of the consequences I suffered as a result of the spiritual portal being opened via the board. For a while in the early days of contacting spirits, when I thought that I was communicating with some of the benevolent spirits via the board, I was getting answers and even some demands from beings I would not want to interact with if I had known better. One was quite sexually obsessed with me, though I did not sexually interact with it, and also wanted me to leave it offerings of things like a cup of wine, a butt of marijuana, or an unlit cigarette. Another being seemed to be a kind of nameless, faceless thing, completely devoid of a personality. When I would ask for its name, I would get a different jumble of random letters every time, whereas other spirits' names would come through clearly and coherently. I had many pictures all over my walls and would sometimes ask a spirit to point me to an image which they felt represented them the most. For example, the spirit of a human girl would direct me to a picture of a girl. This spirit, however, pointed me to a part of a painting which was basically a globe covered in screaming baby faces. Later, it tried to convince me that it was an Enochian angel of the apocalypse. Now, just to elucidate a bit, I'll read the definition of Enochian magic from the Dictionary of the Esoteric by Neville Drury. Enochian magic is a system of magic derived from the work of Elizabethan occultists Dr. John Dee and Edward Kelly, who met in 1581. Dee and Kelly made use of wax tablets called almodels, engraved with magic symbols. They also used magical squares, the largest consisting of 49 rows, filled with letters of the alphabet. Nearby, on his table, Kelly had a large crystal stone upon which he focused his concentration and entered a state of trance reverie. In due course, quote-unquote angels would appear, and they would point to various letters on the squares in turn. These were written down by Dee as Kelly called them out. When these invocations were completely transcribed, Kelly then reversed their order, for he believed that the angels communicated them backwards to avoid unleashing the magical power which they contained. Dee and Kelly considered that the communications formed the basis of a new language known as Enochian. These magical conjurations were subsequently incorporated into magical practice by the ritual magicians of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, who used them to induce trance visions on the astral plane. I should also note that the term apocalypse here actually refers to the end of evil, not the end of the world as we tend to think in our culture these days. Of course, I didn't believe the being for a second and just laughed silently to myself. Later, however, problems with this being would escalate to a serious degree, but I'll talk about that in a future episode. Something else I experienced in that room before I stopped sleeping in it was a growling in my ear when I was in a sub-sleep state, in between dreaming and being fully awake. Sometimes in this state, the growling was accompanied by something clamping onto my arm and thrashing it about. It really seemed like some kind of spectral dog was attacking me. I eventually asked my guide about it, and he said that there was indeed the spirit of a dog who was terrified and trapped in the room, and that it got there because of my use of the board. Somehow, I don't exactly remember how, I was told that his name was Buster, so I started saying his name in a calming voice when I would be in the room. After this, I stopped getting attacked by the dog when I would go to sleep. One day, however, when I was in a sub-sleep state, I suddenly found myself lying on the floor in what looked like an empty apartment or an empty version of my bedroom, to be more accurate now that I think about it. A young, attractive, Middle Eastern-looking man walked in the room nonchalantly. He didn't look at me, but began walking towards me as I was still paralyzed on the floor. As he got closer to me, his body began to stretch out and become thinner until he was an inhumanly tall and skeletal being with an indescribably inhuman face, which began jittering and twisting back and forth at an impossible speed, like you see as a special effect in some horror movies. I believe the first one to do that was Jacob's Ladder. This horrible thing then jumped on my face and stomped all over it before I was able to wake up, jumping out of the bed and gasping. Later that day, when I was in the same room, I was suddenly assaulted with the worst panic attack I've ever had in my life. I was terrified beyond description for no reason whatsoever. For about 3 months after this, I was afflicted with horrible anxiety. It wasn't until years later that I found out from my guide that this advent of panic was caused by the spirit stomping on my face. I also discovered from research that stomping on someone's face is a classic form of magical attack in astral projection or out-of-body states. From that point on, I stopped sleeping in that room, though I continued to use my computer in there. When I would be working on the computer, completely awake, I would hear very faint voices and whispers, almost always extremely unpleasant. For instance, I would hear a lot of women's voices crying or screaming. I remember a distinct voice I heard once. It was a woman whispering seductively in my ear, and I remember exactly what she said. "You will burn in this America.
He was abducted by aliens earlier this afternoon. That little girl got lost under the bed and she went into an alternate dimension.
Okay, I'm going to read an article from the science website Nautilus called Is Matter Conscious? Why the Central Problem in Neuroscience is Mirrored in Physics. And it was written April 6, 2017 by Heda Hassel-Morch. The nature of consciousness seems to be unique among scientific puzzles. Not only do neuroscientists have no fundamental explanation for how it arises from physical states of the brain, we are not even sure whether we ever will. Astronomers wonder what dark matter is, geologists seek the origins of life, and biologists try to understand cancer. All difficult problems, of course, yet at least we have some idea of how to go about investigating them and rough conceptions of what their solutions could look like. Our first-person experience, on the other hand, lies beyond the traditional methods of science. Following philosopher David Chalmers, we call it the hard problem of consciousness. But perhaps consciousness is not uniquely troublesome. Going back to Gottfried Leibniz and Immanuel Kant, philosophers of science have struggled with a lesser-known but equally hard problem of matter. What is physical matter in and of itself behind the mathematical structure described by physics? This problem, too, seems to lie beyond the traditional methods of science because all we can observe is what matter does, not what it is in itself. The quote-unquote software of the universe, but not its ultimate hardware. On the surface, these problems seem entirely separate, while a closer look reveals that they might be deeply connected. Consciousness is a multifaceted phenomenon, but subjective experience is its most puzzling aspect. Our brains do not merely seem to gather and process information. They do not merely undergo biochemical processes. Rather, they create a vivid series of feelings and experiences, such as seeing red, feeling hungry, or being baffled about philosophy. There is something that it's like to be you, and no one else can ever know that as directly as you do. Our own consciousness involves a complex array of sensations, emotions, desires, and thoughts. But, in principle, conscious experiences may be very simple. An animal that feels an immediate pain or an instinctive urge or desire, even without reflecting on it, would also be conscious. Our own consciousness is usually also consciousness of something. It involves awareness or contemplation of things in the world, abstract ideas, or the self. But someone who is dreaming an incoherent dream or hallucinating wildly would still be conscious in the sense of having some kind of subjective experience, even though they are not conscious of anything in particular. Where does consciousness, in its most general sense, come from? Modern science has given us good reason to believe that our consciousness is rooted in the physics and chemistry of the brain, as opposed to anything immaterial or transcendental. In order to get a conscious system, all we need is physical matter. Put it together in the right way, as in the brain, and consciousness will appear. But how and why can consciousness result merely from putting together non-conscious matter in certain complex ways? This problem is distinctly hard because its solution cannot be determined by means of experiment and observation alone. Through increasingly sophisticated experiments and advanced neuroimaging technology, neuroscience is giving us better and better maps of what kinds of conscious experiences depend on what kinds of physical brain states. Neuroscience might also eventually be able to tell us what all of our conscious brain states have in common. For example, that they have high levels of integrated information, per Giulio Tonini's integrated information theory, that they broadcast a message in the brain, per Bernard Barr's global workspace theory, or that they generate 40 Hz oscillations, per an early proposal by Francis Crick and Christoph Koch. But in all these theories, the hard problem remains. How and why does a system that integrates information, broadcasts a message, or oscillates at 40 Hz feel pain or delight? The appearance of consciousness from mere physical complexity seems equally mysterious no matter what precise form the complexity takes. Nor would it seem to help to discover the concrete biochemical and ultimately physical details that underlie this complexity. No matter how precisely we could specify the mechanisms underlying, for example, the perception and recognition of tomatoes, we could still ask, why is this process accompanied by the subjective experience of red or any experience at all? Why couldn't we have just the physical process but no consciousness? Other natural phenomena, from dark matter to life, as puzzling as they may be, don't seem nearly as intractable. In principle, we can see that understanding them is fundamentally a matter of gathering more physical detail, building better telescopes and other instruments, designing better experiments, or noticing new laws and patterns in the data we already have. If we were somehow granted knowledge of every physical detail and pattern in the universe, we would not expect these problems to persist. They would dissolve in the same way the problem of heritability dissolved upon the discovery of the physical details of DNA. But the hard problem of consciousness would seem to persist even given knowledge of every imaginable kind of physical detail. In this way, the deep nature of consciousness appears to lie beyond scientific reach. We take it for granted, however, that physics can, in principle, tell us everything there is to know about the nature of physical matter. Physics tells us that matter is made of particles and fields which have properties such as mass, charge, and spin. Physics may not yet have discovered all the fundamental properties of matter, but it is getting closer. Yet there is reason to believe that there must be more to matter than what physics tells us. Broadly speaking, physics tells us what fundamental particles do or how they relate to other things, but nothing about how they are in themselves independently of other things. Charge, for example, is the property of repelling other particles with the same charge and attracting particles with the opposite charge. In other words, charge is a way of relating to other particles. Similarly, mass is the property of responding to applied forces and of gravitationally attracting other particles with mass, which might in turn be described as curving spacetime or interacting with the Higgs field. These are also things that particles do, or ways of relating to other particles and to spacetime. In general, it seems all fundamental physical properties can be described mathematically. Galileo, the father of modern science, famously professed that the great book of nature is written in the language of mathematics. Yet mathematics is a language with distinct limitations. It can only describe abstract structures and relations. For example, all we know about numbers is how they relate to the other numbers and other mathematical objects. That is, what they quote-unquote do. The rules they follow when added, multiplied, and so on. Similarly, all we know about a geometrical object, such as a node in a graph, is its relation to other nodes. In the same way, a purely mathematical physics can tell us only about the relations between physical entities or the rules that govern their behavior. One might wonder how physical particles are, independently of what they do or how they relate to other things. What are physical things like in themselves, or intrinsically? Some have argued that there is nothing more to particles than their relations, but intuition rebels at this claim. For there to be a relation, there must be two things being related. Otherwise, the relation is empty, a show that goes on without performers, or a castle constructed out of thin air. In other words, physical structure must be realized or implemented by some stuff or substance that is itself not purely structural. Otherwise, there would be no clear difference between physical and mere mathematical structure, or between the concrete universe and a mere abstraction. But what could this stuff that realizes or implements physical structure be, and what are the intrinsic non-structural properties that characterize it? This problem is a close descendant of Kant's classic problem of knowledge of things in themselves. The philosopher Galen Strawson has called it the hard problem of matter. It is ironic because we usually think of physics as describing the hardware of the universe, the real concrete stuff. But in fact, physical matter, at least the aspect that physics tells us about, is more like software, a logical and mathematical structure. According to the hard problem of matter, this software needs some hardware to implement it. Physicists have brilliantly reverse-engineered the algorithms, or the source code, of the universe, but left out their concrete implementation. The hard problem of matter is distinct from other problems of interpretation in physics. Current physics presents puzzles such as, how can matter be both particle-like and wave-like? What is quantum wave function collapse? Are continuous fields or discrete individuals more fundamental? But these are all questions of how to properly conceive of the structure of reality. The hard problem of matter would arise even if we had answers to all such questions about structure. No matter what structure we are talking about, from the most bizarre and unusual to the perfectly intuitive, there will be a question of how it is non-structurally implemented. Indeed, the problem arises even for Newtonian physics, which describes the structure of reality in a way that makes perfect intuitive sense. Roughly speaking, Newtonian physics says that matter consists of solid particles that interact either by bumping into each other or by gravitationally attracting each other. But what is the intrinsic nature of the stuff that behaves in this simple and intuitive way? What is the hardware that implements the software of Newton's equations? One might think the answer is simple. It is implemented by solid particles. But solidity is just the behavior of resisting intrusion and spatial overlap by other particles, that is, another mere relation to other particles in space. The hard problem of matter arises for any structural description of reality, no matter how clear and intuitive at the structural level. Like the hard problem of consciousness, the hard problem of matter cannot be solved by experiment and observation or by gathering more physical detail. This will only reveal more structure, at least as long as physics remains a discipline dedicated to capturing reality in mathematical terms. Might the hard problem of consciousness and the hard problem of matter be connected? There is already a tradition for connecting problems in physics with the problem of consciousness, namely in the area of quantum theories of consciousness. Such theories are sometimes disparaged as fallaciously interfering that because quantum physics and consciousness are both mysterious, together they will somehow be less so. The idea of a connection between the hard problem of consciousness and the hard problem of matter could be criticized on the same grounds. Yet a closer look reveals that these two problems are complementary in a much deeper and more determinate way. One of the first philosophers to notice the connection was Leibniz, all the way back in the late 17th century, but the precise modern version of the idea is due to Bertrand Russell. Recently, contemporary philosophers, including Chalmers and Strawson, have rediscovered it. It goes like this. The hard problem of matter calls for non-structural properties, and consciousness is the one phenomenon we know that might meet this need. Consciousness is full of qualitative properties, from the redness of red and the discomfort of hunger to the phenomenology of thought. Such experiences, or qualia, may have internal structure, but there is more to them than structure. We know something about what conscious experiences are like in and of themselves, not just how they function and relate to other properties. For example, think of someone who has never seen any red objects and has never been told that the color red exists. That person knows nothing about how redness relates to brain states, to physical objects such as tomatoes, or to wavelengths of light, nor how it relates to other colors. For example, that it's similar to orange but very different from green. One day, the person spontaneously hallucinates a big red patch. It seems this person will thereby learn what redness is like, even though he or she doesn't know any of its relations to other things. The knowledge he or she acquires will be non-relational knowledge of what redness is like in and of itself. This suggests that consciousness, of some primitive and rudimentary form, is the hardware that the software described by physics runs on. The physical world can be conceived of as a structure of conscious experiences. Our own richly textured experiences implement the physical relations that make up our brains. Some simple, elementary forms of experiences implement the relations that make up fundamental particles. Take an electron, for example. What an electron does is to attract, repel, and otherwise relate to other entities in accordance with fundamental physical equations. What performs this behavior, we might think, is simply a stream of tiny electron experiences. Electrons and other particles can be thought of as mental beings with physical powers, as streams of experience and physical relations to other streams of experience. This idea sounds strange, even mystical, but it comes out of a careful line of thought about the limitations of science. Leibniz and Russell were determined scientific rationalists, as evidenced by their own immortal contributions to physics, logic, and mathematics, but equally deeply committed to the reality and uniqueness of consciousness. They concluded that in order to give both phenomena their proper due, a radical change of thinking is required. And a radical change it truly is. Philosophers and neuroscientists often assume that consciousness is like software, whereas the brain is like hardware. This suggestion turns this completely around. When we look at what physics tells us about the brain, we actually just find software, purely a set of relations all the way down. And consciousness is in fact more like hardware because of its distinctly qualitative, non-structural properties. For this reason, conscious experiences are just the kind of things that physical structure could be the structure of. Given the solution to the hard problem of matter, the hard problem of consciousness all but dissolves. There is no longer any question of how consciousness arises from non-conscious matter, because all matter is intrinsically conscious. There is no longer a question of how consciousness depends on matter, because it is matter that depends on consciousness, as relations depend on relata, structure depends on realizer, or software on hardware. One might object that this is plain anthropomorphism, an illegitimate projection of human qualities on nature. After all, why do we think that physical structure needs some intrinsic realizer? Is it not because our brains have intrinsic conscious properties and we like to think of nature in familiar terms? But this objection does not hold. The idea that intrinsic properties are needed to distinguish real and concrete from mere abstract structure is entirely independent of consciousness. Moreover, the charge of anthropomorphism can be met by a countercharge of human exceptionalism. If the brain is indeed entirely material, why should it be so different from the rest of matter when it comes to intrinsic properties? This view, that consciousness constitutes the intrinsic aspect of physical reality, goes by many different names, but one of the most descriptive is dual aspect monism. Monism contrasts with dualism, the view that consciousness and matter are fundamentally different substances or kinds of stuff. Dualism is widely regarded as scientifically implausible because science shows no evidence of any non-physical forces that influence the brain. Well, that could be argued, honestly. What about neuroplasticity? Anyway, monism holds that all of reality is made of the same kind of stuff. It comes in several varieties. The most common monistic view is physicalism, also known as materialism, the view that everything is made of physical stuff, which only has one aspect, the one revealed by physics. This is the predominant view among philosophers and scientists today. According to physicalism, a complete, purely physical description of reality leaves nothing out. But according to the hard problem of consciousness, any purely physical description of a conscious system such as the brain at least appears to leave something out. It could never fully capture what it is like to be that system. That is to say, it captures the objective but not the subjective aspects of consciousness, the brain function but not our inner mental life. Russell's dual aspect monism tries to fill in this deficiency. It accepts that the brain is a material system that behaves in accordance with the laws of physics. But it adds another intrinsic aspect to matter, which is hidden from the extrinsic, third-person perspective of physics, and which therefore cannot be captured by any purely physical description. But although this intrinsic aspect eludes our physical theories, it does not elude our inner observations. Our own consciousness constitutes the intrinsic aspect of the brain, and this is our clue to the intrinsic aspect of other physical things. To paraphrase author Schopenhauer's succinct response to Kant, we can know the thing in itself because we are it. Dual aspect monism comes in moderate and radical forms. Moderate versions take the intrinsic aspect of matter to consist of so-called proto-conscious or neutral properties, properties that are unknown to science but also different from consciousness. The nature of such neither mental nor physical properties seems quite mysterious. Like the aforementioned quantum theories of consciousness, moderate dual aspect monism can therefore be accused of merely adding one mystery to another and expecting them to cancel out. The most radical version of dual aspect monism takes the intrinsic aspect of reality to consist of consciousness itself. This is decidedly not the same as subjective idealism, the view that the physical world is merely a structure within human consciousness, and that the external world is in some sense an illusion. According to dual aspect monism, the external world exists entirely independently of human consciousness. But it would not exist independently of any kind of consciousness because all physical things are associated with some form of consciousness of their own as their own intrinsic realizer or hardware. As a solution to the hard problem of consciousness, dual aspect monism faces objections of its own. The most common objection is that it results in panpsychism, the view that all things are associated with some form of consciousness. To critics, it's just too implausible that fundamental particles are conscious, and indeed this idea takes some getting used to. But consider the alternatives. Dualism looks implausible on scientific grounds. Physicalism takes the objective, scientifically accessible aspect of reality to be the only reality, which arguably implies that the subjective aspect of consciousness is an illusion. Maybe so, but shouldn't we be more confident that we are conscious in the full subjective sense than that particles are not? A second important objection is the so-called combination problem. How and why does the complex, unified consciousness of our brains result from putting together particles with simple consciousness? This question looks suspiciously similar to the original hard problem. I and other defenders of panpsychism have argued that the combination problem is nevertheless not as hard as the original hard problem. In some ways, it is easier to see how to get one form of conscious matter, such as a conscious brain, from another form of conscious matter, such as a set of conscious particles, than how to get conscious matter from non-conscious matter. But many find this unconvincing. Perhaps it is just a matter of time, though. The original hard problem, in one form or another, has been pondered by philosophers for centuries. The combination problem has received much less attention, which gives more hope for a yet undiscovered solution. The possibility that consciousness is the real concrete stuff of reality, the fundamental hardware that implements the software of our physical theories, is a radical idea. It completely inverts our ordinary picture of reality in a way that can be difficult to fully grasp. But it may solve two of the hardest problems in science and philosophy at once.
Science can explain everything if we look hard enough.
Shut up, science bitch.
Alright, like I said earlier, I eventually moved out of that apartment, but many more very strange things occurred before I got out of there. I would come back home to sometimes find furniture knocked over. A friend who was watching my apartment while I was away said that at some point, as he was watching a movie, he heard a loud and distinct voice behind him say, "You've been here long enough, I think it's time for you to leave now." He instantly grabbed his things and took off. Well, one morning I woke up to find my front door wide open. Both bolts had been locked, so it could not have been a maintenance man who unlocked it and forgot to close it. This is because they can't open the top lock. Years later, as I was moving out of this cursed place, a very awful and angry feeling was growing. It was especially concentrated in the bedroom where I had used the board. My guide told me that it was a nasty spirit who had been spiritually victimizing me for years, and it was livid that I was getting away from it. Now I just really feel bad for whoever moved in after me. Do not use a Ouija board. Next time, I'll talk about the first spirits I met after my god.
Not only is he like ruining my life,
Alright, have a nice day.
but with all this god shit that he's into, he could be ruining my afterlife.
It's a sort of interdimensional vagina that somehow appears. I can interact with it.
Fabric of the entire universe could be torn apart.
I know my mind is changing. I'm already too far gone to know what to do.